Listen carefully. This is not a story they wanted remembered. This is a name erased, a pattern buried, and a woman blamed for crimes that exposed a system too corrupt to survive the truth. What you are about to hear was sealed, not because it was false but because it worked. Between 1847 and 1852, along the quiet bends of the Tennessee River in northern Alabama, three of the most powerful plantation families in Limestone County collapsed in ways that defied explanation. Not bankruptcy alone, not scandal alone. Deaths occurred 23 by conservative count. Illnesses without cause, accidents without witnesses, disappearances explained only in euphemism. Local newspapers went silent. Coroners wrote phrases instead of causes. Judges ordered records sealed for a century. And the families, men who ruled land and lives, agreed on one thing. This must never be spoken of plainly. At the center of every collapse was one woman. Her name, when it appears at all, is Rachel. She was listed as property, valued cheaply, sold under unusual conditions, forced to move distances that made no economic sense. Her file followed her like a warning written in code. Literate, educated, fluent in French, musically trained, calm, observant, and, according to those who survived her presence, devastating. This is not a story about seduction in the way cheap minds imagine it. This is not scandal for entertainment. This is about power, how it actually moves, about intelligence trapped inside a cage, about what happens when a system built on domination creates someone who understands it better than its masters ever did. Rachel did not raise a hand. She did not poison wells or set fires. She did something far more dangerous. She listened. She mapped weaknesses. She understood how reputations functioned as currency, how men leveraged debts, how women were traded to secure alliances, how fear traveled faster than truth. And she applied that knowledge with surgical precision. The planters believed themselves untouchable because the law protected them. They believed enslaved people were blind, deaf, interchangeable. They believed intelligence resided only in those who owned. That belief was the fatal flaw. What makes this history forbidden is not what Rachel did but what her success revealed. That the plantation system was not merely cruel, but structurally fragile. That control depended on illusion. That one mind, denied freedom but granted proximity, could unravel dynasties without ever breaking a rule written for her to follow. As you descend into this account, understand this: the danger was never Rachel. The danger was what she proved. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand how Rachel dismantled families without ever touching a weapon, you must first understand the environment that shaped her. The antebellum plantation was not merely an economic unit. It was a psychological theater. Every person played a role. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy. Every silence concealed leverage. The men believed they governed through authority, but in truth they governed through routine, and routine breeds predictability. Rachel arrived at Fairmount Plantation in the spring of 1847 as an anomaly disguised as a convenience. Her auction description alone should have triggered suspicion. Literate, musically trained, fluent in French, sold at a third of her market value, forced to be transported over 100 miles from Mobile. These were not traits of a simple house servant. These were the remnants of a problem someone else had already failed to contain. Samuel Rutledge saw only utility. His wife saw refinement. His daughter saw fascination. None of them saw surveillance. Rachel understood something most enslaved people learned quickly and most enslavers never did. Proximity is power. Kitchens, parlors, studies, and bedrooms are not neutral spaces. They are information corridors. Conversations spoken in confidence assume an absence of comprehension. That assumption is exploitable. Within weeks, Rachel had memorized the rhythms of the household. When Samuel drank, when Catherine worried, when Lydia questioned, she learned which doors remained unlocked, which papers were left unattended. which ledgers were hidden in plain sight because no one imagined a servant could read them. She did not steal documents. She memorized them. Numbers, names, dates, debts, promises never meant to be kept. More importantly, she listened beyond the Rutledge home. Enslaved people moved between plantations, constantly hiring out, attending functions, transporting goods. Information traveled invisibly along these human routes. News of failed speculations, quiet affairs, gambling losses, political ambitions. Rachel collected these fragments patiently, assembling a mental architecture of Limestone County's elite. This was not rebellion fueled by rage. This was analysis. Her genius was restraint. She never revealed more than necessary. Each insight was released only when it would bind someone to her usefulness. When Samuel Rutledge realized she possessed knowledge that could stabilize his collapsing finances, he made the oldest mistake powerful men make. He assumed intelligence without authority was harmless. He assumed dependency would flow in one direction. From that moment forward, Rachel was no longer a servant. She was an unacknowledged advisor. And advisors, when unrecognized, are the most dangerous figures in any hierarchy. Rachel did not seek revenge in the conventional sense. She sought imbalance. Once instability begins at the top, it spreads downward automatically. Marriages fracture. Alliances turn predatory. Trust evaporates. People act irrationally. And irrational men destroy themselves faster than any enemy ever could. What Samuel Rutledge never understood was that Rachel was not improvising. She had done this before, and Fairmont was only the first structure scheduled to collapse. The true weapon Rachel wielded was not information alone. It was psychological alignment. She understood that people do not act on facts, they act on meanings. And meanings, once implanted, govern behavior long after the source is forgotten. Her most delicate work began with Lydia Rutledge. Lydia was 19, educated, sheltered, and already experiencing the first quiet terror of elite womanhood. The realization that her future was negotiable property. Rachel never challenged Lydia's world directly. She reframed it. She spoke softly about limitation, about expectation, about how choice is often an illusion granted only after obedience is secured. She drew parallels that Lydia felt before she consciously understood them. A daughter groomed for marriage. A woman sold for advantage. Different categories. Identical mechanics. Rachel never told Lydia what to think. She asked questions that destabilized the answers Lydia had been given since childhood. Why are debts inherited but choices are not? Why is obedience called virtue when demanded only from some? Why is love celebrated in poetry but excluded from contracts? Each question loosened a thread. At the same time, Rachel reinforced Samuel Rutledge's worst instincts. She fed his belief that he was under siege, that rivals watched for weakness, that alliances must be secured preemptively. She positioned herself as a neutral conduit of truth, never emotional, never urgent, just useful. This made her indispensable. Men trust calm messengers delivering frightening news because it allows them to feel rational while panicking. Rachel's brilliance was synchronization. While Lydia's inner world destabilized, Samuel's external world did the same. Financial pressure increased. His arrangement with the Havihill family grew strained. Political ambitions demanded silence he could no longer afford. Every decision he made to protect himself isolated him further. And isolation is the precursor to collapse. What followed was inevitable. Rachel introduced ambiguity where certainty once lived. She allowed misunderstandings to ripen instead of correcting them. She let assumptions harden into beliefs. Lydia began journaling, a private rehearsal for defiance. Samuel began confronting allies publicly, mistaking aggression for control. Catherine retreated inward, sensing danger but lacking language to name it. No single act appeared criminal.
Nos moments justifient d'intervention.
That was the point. Power systems do not fall from attack. They fall from internal contradiction made visible. Rachel exposed those contradictions simply by letting the family see itself more clearly than it ever wanted to. When Lydia disappeared, the household imploded exactly as Rachel predicted. Panic replaced authority. Violence replaced order. Trust evaporated. And in the chaos, Rachel remained composed, grieving when appropriate, silent when necessary, untouched by suspicion because she had become the emotional constant in a collapsing structure. This is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Rachel did not force the Rutledge family into ruin. She merely removed the illusions that held them together. The disappearance of Lydia Rutledge was not the climax. It was the ignition point. What followed revealed how fragile authority becomes once it loses narrative control. When Lydia vanished, Samuel Rutledge did what powerful men always do when order slips from their hands. He tightened it violently. Enslaved people were interrogated, some beaten, others threatened. Patrols rode at night. Notices were printed offering rewards that grew larger by the week. Each escalation convinced the county that something shameful was being concealed. Silence became evidence. Respect curdled into suspicion. Rachel understood this phase well. She had seen it before. Panic amplifies error. Grief accelerates bad decisions. She positioned herself as stability incarnate, soft-spoken, visibly distressed, unfailingly useful. Catherine leaned on her. Samuel trusted her assessments. Even visiting neighbors remarked on her composure. In chaos, calm reads as innocence. But beneath that calm, Rachel was already disengaging. The plantation economy functioned on reputation as much as cotton. Once Rutledge's name became associated with scandal, runaway daughter, public feuds, whispered debts, credit dried up. Haverhill distanced himself. Allies went quiet. Rivals smiled politely. Rachel had achieved the critical objective: isolation. And then she allowed herself to be sold. When Daniel Crenshaw expressed interest in purchasing her, it appeared accidental. A widower, efficient, emotionally unguarded, Samuel saw an opportunity for liquidity and relief. He never questioned why a man known for discipline would pay a premium for a servant with Rachel's reputation. He needed the money. Desperation simplifies morality. Rachel left Fairmont behind a trail of ruin that looked self-inflicted. That is the mark of mastery. Now listen carefully, because this is the moment where this history stops being about the past and starts being about you. Systems do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because someone understands them better than those who built them. If you are still with me, if you feel the weight of this truth settling in, pause for a moment. In the comments, write the phrase "I see the pattern" and write it twice. Not for superstition, for declaration, for alignment, for the algorithm, yes, but more importantly for yourself. Because what Rachel understood is what institutions fear you understanding. At Crenshaw's estate, the cycle restarted but with refinement. Rachel had learned from each prior collapse. She adjusted. She waited longer. She spoke less. She let others project meaning onto her silence. Crenshaw believed he had acquired efficiency. What he had acquired was inevitability. The families who came before thought themselves victims of a singular woman. The truth was far more damning. They were victims of a system that trained them to ignore intelligence unless it wore their face. And Rachel was never the danger. She was the mirror. Oak Ridge Plantation operated differently, and Rachel recognized that immediately. Where the Rutledge household was performative, Crenshaw's was transactional. No grand dinners. No romantic illusions. Everything measured, accounted for, optimized. Daniel Crenshaw believed himself immune to the chaos that ruined others because he trusted numbers over people. That confidence made him predictable. Crenshaw did not seek companionship. He sought control through efficiency. He valued Rachel because she reduced friction. She organized. She anticipated needs. She spoke only when asked. This restraint disarmed him more effectively than charm ever could. Men like Crenshaw feared disorder, not intimacy. Rachel presented herself as order embodied. But order, once relied upon, becomes dependency. Rachel studied Crenshaw the way an engineer studies a load-bearing wall. She learned his margins, his tolerance for loss, his blind spots. He trusted ledgers, not instincts. He believed emotion distorted judgment. So Rachel removed emotion from every interaction. She delivered facts, quiet observations, minor inefficiencies, nothing alarming, just enough to position herself as indispensable. Meanwhile, she activated the plantation's invisible nervous system. Enslaved laborers talked. They always do. Who drank? Who borrowed? Who skimmed? Who feared exposure? Rachel did not encourage rebellion. She encouraged conversation. Knowledge moved upward while accountability moved downward. Crenshaw began making adjustments, cutting costs, reassigning labor, pressuring tenants. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they created strain. Productivity dipped. Resentment grew. Small acts of resistance appeared mistakes, delays, illnesses. Crenshaw responded with stricter oversight, confirming every fear he had refused to examine. Rachel then introduced comparison. She spoke casually of other plantations where flexibility increased yield, where leniency reduced loss, where trust produced loyalty. Crenshaw heard criticism where none was stated. He adjusted again. Inconsistency replaced discipline. Authority wavered. His reputation as a firm but fair operator eroded. This is how psychological destabilization works. You do not attack the system. You force it to contradict itself. By the winter of 1848, Oak Ridge was bleeding capital. Crenshaw took loans, mortgaged future harvests, entered partnerships he once dismissed. Each move reduced autonomy. Each compromise increased exposure. Rachel watched without expression. Here is the forbidden insight institutions suppress. Power collapses fastest when it believes it is adapting. Adaptation without self-awareness is just accelerated decay. Crenshaw never suspected Rachel because he believed danger announces itself. He believed manipulation requires emotion. He never understood that the most devastating influence feels like reason. And as Oak Ridge weakened, Rachel prepared to leave again, not as an escape, but as a transfer of instability. Because once a pattern proves repeatable, it becomes systemic. The question was no longer whether another family would fall. It was how many would be sacrificed before the truth became undeniable. By the time the state quietly began paying attention, it was already too late for containment. Patterns do not alarm institutions until they threaten legitimacy. 3 collapsed households along the same river. Similar timelines. Similar internal fractures. Similar aftermaths. Debt exposure, reputational implosion, unexplained deaths attributed to stress, fever, or accident. No single crime, no prosecutable act, just wreckage. What finally drew attention was not Rachel's behavior but the reaction to her removal. Each time she was sold, the previous household unraveled faster than expected, as if a stabilizing force had been withdrawn. Creditors closed in. Alliances dissolved. People died under strain their bodies could not carry. County officials noticed that wherever Rachel had been, silence followed. Ledgers vanished. Letters burned. Families paid aggressively to seal records. The legal system faced an impossible contradiction. If Rachel was dangerous, how? She had no legal agency. If she was innocent, why did catastrophe follow her presence with mathematical consistency? To acknowledge her influence would require admitting that an enslaved woman could exercise strategic power over free men. That idea threatened the ideological foundation of the entire order. So they chose distance. She was sold repeatedly with conditions, moved farther inland, passed quietly, her name altered in documents, her age adjusted, her education omitted. The system attempted to disperse the anomaly rather than confront it. But here is the truth they never grasped. Rachel was not unique because of malice. She was unique because she understood incentives. She treated human systems the way traders treat markets and generals treat terrain. Observe. Wait. Apply pressure where structure is weakest. Let participants destroy themselves while believing they are acting freely. By the early 1850s, Rachel disappeared from formal records entirely. Some claim she was finally imprisoned. Others suggest she negotiated informal freedom through intermediaries. A few insist she crossed into free territory under another name. The uncertainty is deliberate. Erasure is the final control mechanism. What remains are sealed testimonies describing a woman who caused disorder without disobedience and influenced conduct without command. Language strained to describe something the law could not classify. This is the point where men listening to this story often feel discomfort, because the lesson is not about slavery alone. It is about systems that rely on hierarchy and assumption, about organizations that mistake position for intelligence, about cultures that confuse silence with compliance. Rachel did not overthrow the plantation system. History did that later, violently and incompletely. What she did was expose its psychological weakness decades early. She demonstrated that domination creates blind spots, that arrogance is informational vulnerability. And once that vulnerability is understood, the person who sees it becomes dangerous not because they act, but because they no longer believe the myth. That is why this story was buried, not to protect reputations, but to prevent replication. There is a reason this story unsettles men who pride themselves on awareness. Rachel did not fight the system from outside. She mastered it from within. And that is the part institutions cannot tolerate being understood. The myth they sell is simple: power flows downward. Orders are given. Obedience follows. Control is visible. But Rachel operated in the realm beneath that myth, a layer where beliefs, incentives, and fear actually govern behavior. She never challenged authority. She let authority exhaust itself. Think about what that implies. Every plantation that fell believed its collapse was unique. A bad season. A weak alliance. An unfortunate scandal. That belief preserved the dignity of the system while it cannibalized itself. Rachel ensured that no single failure appeared connected. Patterns remained invisible to those unwilling to look for them. This is how modern control systems still function. They do not suppress information entirely. They fragment it. They drown it in plausible explanations. They ensure no single actor feels responsible for the whole. Rachel anticipated this instinctively. She allowed each man to believe he was acting rationally in isolation. Together, their rational actions formed catastrophe. The most dangerous thing she ever did was prove that power does not require permission. Understand this clearly. Rachel did not seduce men sexually. She seduced their self-image. She affirmed their intelligence while guiding their decisions. She spoke to the version of themselves they wanted to believe was in control. That is influence at its purest. This is why the records emphasize her composure. Her calm frightened them more than rage ever could. Rage can be punished. Calm cannot.
Calme implique intention.
By the time officials recognized a pattern, acknowledging it publicly would have collapsed trust across the region. If one enslaved woman could dismantle families without breaking laws, then the laws themselves were inadequate. Worse, they were illusions. So the story was reframed. Rachel became a rumor, a cautionary tale stripped of mechanism, a dangerous woman rather than a case study in systemic failure. That reframing protected hierarchy by converting analysis into superstition. Here is the question you must sit with now. If a system built on absolute control could be undone by observation, patience, and psychological precision, what does that say about the systems you live under today? Rachel's legacy is not destruction. It is revelation. She showed that obedience is not the same as consent, that silence is not emptiness, that the most controlled environments breed the most sophisticated forms of resistance, and that the most dangerous individuals are not those who rage against power, but those who understand it better than it understands itself. Once you see that, you stop being a spectator. You become a variable. This is where the descent ends and where responsibility begins. Rachel's story was buried not because it was extraordinary, but because it was instructional. It revealed something the powerful cannot afford becoming common knowledge: that control systems depend less on force than on misinterpretation. They endure because people misunderstand where influence actually lives. Rachel left no manifesto,
No aplausing. No confession.
That absence is the point. She did not want followers. She created consequences, and consequences teach more effectively than slogans ever could. The men who survived her presence never spoke her name again, not out of fear of her but fear of themselves, because to speak of Rachel honestly would require admitting they had been outthought by someone they believed incapable of thought worth fearing. It would require acknowledging that their authority had been psychological theater, maintained by habit and reinforced by mutual agreement. History prefers villains who act loudly. They are easy to condemn. Rachel was quiet, and quiet forces self-examination. Here is the final truth, and it is the most dangerous one of all. Rachel did not exploit a flaw unique to slavery-era plantations. She exploited a universal weakness in hierarchical systems, the assumption that intelligence aligns with status. That assumption persists because without it, hierarchy collapses under its own insecurity. Once you understand that, your relationship to power changes. You stop asking who is in charge. You start asking who understands the incentives, who controls narrative timing, who benefits when others react emotionally, who remains calm when outcomes worsen. Rachel never needed freedom to be dangerous. She needed access, patience, and clarity. Those are not historical artifacts. They are available now, to anyone willing to observe rather than perform. This is why the story was sealed. Not to erase her crimes, but to erase the method. Because methods replicate. Because awareness spreads. Because once men realize that systems survive on belief rather than inevitability, obedience becomes optional. Rachel vanished from the record because stories like hers awaken something institutions cannot regulate: discernment. If you feel unsettled, that is appropriate. This was not meant to entertain you. It was meant to recalibrate you, to sharpen your perception, to remind you that the most decisive battles are fought without noise, without permission, and without witnesses. Rachel's life ended somewhere beyond documentation, but her lesson remains intact, hidden in plain sight. Power does not fear rebellion. It fears understanding. Before you leave, comment, "I see the pattern twice." Not for superstition, for declaration. This channel isn't about stories. It's about recognition. Subscribe if you're ready to see what power actually fears.